One. Thank you. This meeting's being recorded, apparently. Welcome to the Louisiana Historical Association's virtual conference. This session here entitled Spain, Britain, and Louisiana in the Colonial Period and Early Statehood. My name is Gene Smith. I am professor of history at Texas Christian University, and there's Jackson, thank goodness. Professor of history at Texas Christian University, a scholar of the early republic, and I volunteered to be the session chair for this meeting, not understanding, or not at the time not understanding it, we'd be doing it in a virtual format, but nonetheless I've had a lot of experience of that over the last few months. In any case, we had 4 papers scheduled for today. The first paper by Daniel Velasquez from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. That paper was entitled Spanish New Orleans, Crossroads of Empire and Key to New Spain, 1763 to 1803. He has had some family crises and he is unable to join us today. So with his not being available to join us, we'll move on to our second paper today by James MacDonald of Northwestern State University, a paper entitled, I Am Going for a Few Days Over the River into Louisiana. John Sibley, an Early Information Gathering in Louisiana, 1803-1807. James, would you like to share your paper with us, please?
Absolutely, and thank you everyone for joining today. I'll go ahead and get started. In 1806, Thomas Jefferson submitted to Congress the accomplishments of Lewis and Clark in their journey to the Pacific Ocean. It was part of his 6th annual message. Attached to the missive, the president included reports from the Dunbar and Hunter mission along the Ouachita River and John Sibley's accounts of the Red River. The message and accompanying documents represent Jefferson's purposeful attempt to find out more about the potential of a little understood area of the continent. If the territory could be developed and American sovereignty established, Jefferson's Empire of Liberty would become a reality. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, an improbable person became Indian agent for the United States government in North Louisiana. John Sibley, a surgeon by training and sometime newspaper publisher from North Carolina, moved to the Gulf South in 1802. The journal he kept of the travels ascending the Mississippi and Red Rivers got the attention of persons of influence in the region, including William C.C. Claiborne. Sibley's observations on geography, botany, and Indian ethnography established him as Jefferson's point man in Northwest Louisiana and the most informed individual in an area the administration knew next to nothing about. Moreover, his fact-finding reports made it clear the United States needed to accelerate efforts to not only explore the Louisiana Territory, but increase efforts to establish American sovereignty in the area. Before his move to Louisiana in 1802, John Sibley spent the years after the Revolution in Fayetteville, North Carolina, raising a family and running the successful Fayetteville Gazette. Successful until the paper was destroyed by fire in 1794, and little is known about Sibley's life in the next decade. At some point, he made a decision to arrange a trip to New Orleans. Why the sudden departure, we're pretty much not entirely certain. He might have been exploring some economic opportunities. Maybe he was just being patriotic and thought he could offer some service to his country. Perhaps Sibley, inspired by stories of the transfer of Louisiana, desired simply to start a new life away from Fayetteville. It's fair to assume that temporary business could have taken him south. That's what he seemed to tell us in some of his journal and letters. Only 45 years old in 1802, the move could have just as easily been instigated by something of a youthful sense of adventure. The medical profession, which he probably returned to after fire devastated his newspaper, may have simply burned him out. Or, as the evidence teases out the possibility, John Sibley left because his marriage fell apart. Even the most detailed study of his life up to this point, which is a master's thesis done by one of his family descendants, is unable to chronicle his life from 1794 to 1802. We know George Washington appointed him Fayetteville's first postmaster general in 1793, a position he held until 1797. Sibley also joined Fayetteville's Democratic Republican Society, one of 7 in the Carolinas during the 1790s. Then and suddenly, Sibley traveled to Charleston and secured passage to New Orleans. His eye for detail and talent for organization are readily apparent when you read the journal he kept on his southern sojourn. Leaving Charleston in July of 1802, he sailed south through the Bahamas and Cuba, arriving on the Great River, as he called it, during the second week of September. He sprinkles the account with an outsider's perspective of New Orleans, including everything from the overwhelmingly French population to the intricacies of gumbo. Sibley paints a positive image of the Crescent City and the river environs. Sugar plantations abound, nearly 70 in the vicinity of New Orleans. River and lake traffic are active as people move cotton towards the city from the north, and coasting vessels ply the waters of Lake Pontchartrain. The Yankee doctor is also fascinated by the people. After commenting on the locals' practice of walking on the levee during the evening, Sibley claims, quote, "Few parts of the world can exhibit better-looking people of both sexes or better dressed or of a greater variety of complexion," unquote. In between his descriptions of the land, the people, and the lifestyles of New Orleans, John Sibley connects with individuals who will forever change his life. He met with several officials, both past and present, Spanish and American, who lived in the Gulf South region. Before obtaining passage by barge upriver, Sibley acquired a passport from the Spanish governor and letters of introduction to Stephen Minor, governor of the Natchez district, former territorial governor Winthrop Sargent, and William Dunbar. Dunbar at the time operated a large plantation near Natchez and would later co-helm with fellow scientist George Hunter an expedition on the Upper Red and Washita River in 1804 at the behest of President Jefferson. When Sibley reached Washington, Mississippi, he reunited with an old friend from his North Carolina days, Judge Kerr, and met William C.C. Claiborne. So began a working relationship which proved fortunate for both men. Claiborne spoke of meeting Sibley to Jefferson when he recollects, quote, "He passed a few weeks in the Mississippi Territory in the year 1802 and was occasionally at my house. I was pleased with him as an agreeable companion and man of information. I have since received many interesting letters from the doctor, which contained, as I suppose, much valuable information," unquote. It doesn't seem hard to believe or imagine that Claiborne, inquired of Sibley about the possibility of extending his Louisiana stopover further and continuing the practice of keeping a detailed journal. After conversing with former Governor Sargent, an Adams appointee who Claiborne replaced as territorial governor of Mississippi, Sibley then reached a crossroads in the Mississippi Territory. He delivered the letters to new acquaintances, and no doubt he discussed the little-known Red River area with Claiborne, Dunbar, and Sargent. Sibley resolved in February 1803 to remain in Louisiana. His diary entries during the series of weeks on the Mississippi read a lot like something of a social pilgrimage, as Sibley enjoyed Southern hospitality and simultaneously became aware from his hosts that a trustworthy set of eyes might be needed on the Upper Red River. At the end of the month, he wrote his son Samuel Hopkins Sibley, acknowledging, quote, "I have not been able to finish my business here so as to set off on my return. How soon I shall effect it is uncertain. I shall lose no time I can avoid. Do the best you can in the meantime for yourself and afford to your mother and children all the assistance and comfort in your power," unquote. Clearly, a mixture of considerations convinced John Sibley that his stay in the Deep South would be prolonged, whether it be new economic opportunities, which some of his fellow Northerners could attest to, appeal of adventure, or patriotic sense of duty to serve his country. Whichever the motivating factor, over the next several years, he would establish himself as one of the most able and fortunate civil servants for the Jefferson administration. In the upcoming months, Sibley became a master self-promoter as well as a tireless advocate for American interests in Lower Louisiana. During the spring of 1803, as American officials finalized the purchase of Louisiana, Sibley turned his sights on the Red River. He told his son that, quote, "I am in pretty good health. I'm going for a few days over the river into Louisiana, which country is very little known in the United States, though the finest country in the world. I keep a journal of my travels with pretty lengthy remarks. Some extracts would amuse you, unquote. Like many of us who initially think a move into Louisiana might be temporary, Sibley probably expected to compile information for Claiborne and return at some point to Fayetteville and his family. Instead, he made the Red River his home for the next 3 decades. Claiborne began to send President Jefferson reports of the area in the fall of 1803 based on information he received from Dr. Sibley. In several letters, Claiborne referred to Sibley as, quote, an ingenious correspondent of mine, residing at Natchitoches on the Red River, and a gentleman and a man of good general information, unquote. Sibley promised Claiborne a map of the Red River, but also sent a detailed description based on his travels up the river in early 1803. The journal became one of the most authoritative accounts of the Red River country up until that time. His voyage took him nearly 400 miles from Natchez to Natchitoches. He continued for 70 or 80 miles above the small French town before doubling back. For information farther north, Sibley relied on his French translator, Francis Grappa, as well as the hunter, Mr. Brevel, who frequented caddo lands on the river. Though he would call the area home for the rest of his life, Sibley first describes Natchitoches as a small, irregular, and meanly built village, half a dozen houses excepted, on the west side of that division of the river it is on. The high pine and oak woods approach within 200 or 300 yards of the river. In the village are about 40 families, 12 or 15 are merchants or traders, nearly all French. The fort built by our troops since their arrival, called Fort Claiborne, is situated on a small hill 1 street from the river and about 30 feet higher than the river banks. All the hill is occupied by the fort and barracks and does not exceed 2 acres of ground. The southern and eastern prospects from it are very beautiful. One has an extensive view of the fields and habitations down the river, and the other a similar view over the river and of the whole village. This town, 30 or 40 years ago, was much larger than at present and situated on a hill about half a mile from its present state, unquote. Though he lacked firsthand knowledge on some of the areas of which he writes, Sibley in his account vouches for Grappa, who lived for 30 years at a French post 500 river miles above Natchitoches, and Brevel, whose information may have been about 4 decades old. Sibley spoke of Grappa and his, quote, strict integrity. Whatever the information I have received from him has been confirmed by every other intelligent person having knowledge of the same with whom I have conversed, unquote. He might have not been as confident about Brevel, but lacking a better source and probably reluctant to make the journey on his own, he passed along what he acquired. Sibley's report, known as the Account of the Red River and Country Adjacent, calculated accurate measurements about the Red River, including the soil, agricultural production, and economic potential. Though perhaps the work of a lackadaisical, some have called him armchair explorer, the work served an immediate objective. Isaac Jocelyn Cox, who wrote a multi-part history of the Louisiana-Texas frontier a century ago, concludes that Sibley's account adds little to scientific knowledge and is more effective as a commentary on Spanish government in Louisiana during the last 4 decades. A closer look at Sibley's account begs a more nuanced interpretation, though. Yes, Sibley commented on the tolerable quality of cheese from the farms on Bayou Pierre and excellent bacon from the river bottom settlements above Natchitoches, but gentle hints at a larger strategic vision fill the account. Sibley catalogs the concentrations of settlements along the Red River with the types of farming the residents engaged in, details which would be music to the ears of Americans already swarming into the area. Physical challenges such as rapids and river blockages are discussed, along with cotton barge traffic and an emerging salt works enterprise. He also recognizes the need to establish a stronger American presence on the Red River. Sibley lobbies for both a modest fort near the Grand Ecorse Bluffs, as well as a trading post for Indians, similar to a facility once operated by the French. Reassured that his correspondence with Claiborne was having the desired effect, Sibley next appealed directly to Thomas Jefferson. No doubt aware that his patron Claiborne forwarded his journal entries to Washington, Sibley, as a way to introduce himself a year after arriving in Natchitoches, wrote Jefferson telling him a bit about his early life as a New England physician and time in North Carolina. Knowing Jefferson to be a nature lover, Sibley went on to describe the yellow bow wood and its potential as a dye for wool and axe handles. He proceeds to tell Jefferson he would like to, quote, beg leave to make you a tender of my services in whatever manner you may think proper to command them, unquote. The manner preferred by Claiborne and Jefferson was to move slowly by first awarding Sibley the commission of contract surgeon to the American soldiers who occupied Fort Claiborne in Natchitoches. Sibley, meanwhile, continued to, quote, make himself useful, if not indispensable, unquote. He promised Claiborne a map of the area between the Mississippi and River Grande up through Santa Fe, as well as estimates concerning the western boundary of Louisiana. Within a year of arriving at Natchitoches, John Sibley fulfilled these expectations. The Massachusetts doctor flooded the executive branch with reports from the Red River region, bombarding the administration with observations on botany and Indian ethnography. At the end of 1804, the Secretary of War, Henry Dearborn, instructed Sibley to, quote, act occasionally as an agent for the United States in such conferences with the chiefs and others of the several Indian tribes in the vicinity of Natchitoches, unquote. For this, Sibley received $3,000 worth of supplies to use as gifts and symbols of friendship of the United States. Dearborn concluded his letter with a request to produce, within 6 months, an account of the Indians in the area. Sibley complied and completed 2 reports on Native Americans. Sibley's persistent record of sending information in New Orleans and Washington would eventually win the endorsement of President Jefferson. In an 1805 letter to Claiborne, he comments, quote, I see no ground, therefore, for wishing his appointments had not been made. On the contrary, we have already received from him a valuable statement of the several Indian tribes of Indians residing within the territory of Orleans, unquote. By that time, Dr. Sibley already had dispatched his lengthy letter to Claiborne about the formal borders of the Louisiana Territory. Though Sibley could not acquire a published map, he did his best to sketch one and encouraged Claiborne to expand the draft to a more usable size for reproduction. A second item consisted of an appendix Sibley titled The 1804 Account of the Indians, which Secretary of War Dearborn deemed, quote, very satisfactory and perused with pleasure, unquote. Both items were placed before Congress in 1806 to supplement information from the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery expedition and the Dunbar-Hunter Red River mission. John Sibley, however, would not be part of the expeditions which explore the Red River and surrounding areas in the first decade of the 19th century. Instead, he successfully carried out the duties of Indian agent until his removal in 1815. Even before his appointment became official, he met with the Caddo-Hattico leader, Tehahuit, in May of 1804, which produced a peace between the Caddo people and the Choctaw. Later that year, Sibley presented the Caddo-Hattico with powder, lead, tobacco, and an American flag. In expeditions which explored the region after Sibley's arrival, invitations went out to other nations in the hope each would travel to the new Natchitoches Indian Trading Factory, which opened in 1806. By that point, Sibley's efforts cemented the allegiance of several Red River Indian groups. As Todd Smith argues, quote, Sibley was the most important American on the border vis-a-vis the natives. He was fair and wise in his dealings with them and always treated the tribes, especially the Caddo-Hatticos, with great respect. Because the friendship of the natives was critical during the first years of Louisiana, an agent who protected their interests was crucial. And in John Sibley, the United States had found the right person, unquote. So after 1803, John Sibley became essentially a quintessential Johnny-on-the-spot outsider who positioned himself in the right place at the right time. Starving for information, desperate to establish American sovereignty in the area, Jefferson and Claiborne leaned on Sibley to gather data about Louisiana. Sibley, without training as an ethnographer or a diplomat, proved more than capable of the task. Whatever reservations the Jefferson administration had about appointing Sibley to positions of authority were put aside as the clever doctor initiated a deluge of reports to Claiborne in New Orleans and the executive branch in Washington. His actions helped fill a serious vacuum of information. concerning Louisiana, which the American government desperately tried to fill after 1800. Thomas Jefferson always had a twofold mission concerning his initiation of explorations into new lands. He wanted to learn about the potential for settlement in a new area, as well as solidify American claims to the territory. At the same time, the president hoped, as Frank Owsley and Gene Smith remind us, to provide, quote, the opportunity to increase the sum of total human knowledge, unquote. A desire to learn more about geography, natural history, and the inhabitants of the Purchase prompted him to authorize expeditions of Lewis and Clark, Dunbar Hunter, and Freeman and Custis. And when John Sibley reported about all things interesting to Jefferson, the president and cabinet took advantage of his loyalty and skills at observation. Sibley insinuated himself into the American South and became a critical font of information for the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I should be punished for not introducing you properly to begin with. Our speaker had just been James MacDonald. He's professor of history at Northwestern State University in Natchitoches. He teaches classes on the American Revolution, the early republic, the West, Atlantic slavery. He also serves on the editorial board of Southern Studies, an interdisciplinary journal of the South, as well as on the publications committee for the Louisiana Historical Association. Thank you so much for your presentation. Okay, I should have also mentioned, if you have any comments or questions, please leave them on the chat function for the Zoom. That way we can get back to them and make sure that they are properly responded to. Okay, our second presentation today will be by Jackson Pearson. Jackson Pearson is a PhD student at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth. Prior to arriving at TCU, Jackson earned his BSE and MA degrees from Jacksonville State University in Jacksonville, Alabama. His research examines the Neutral Ground Agreement and the Louisiana-Texas borderlands, beginning with the Louisiana Purchase and concluding with the settlement of the Rio Hondo land claims in 1825. His scholarship focuses on how commerce and the environment define the imperial struggle for sovereignty in the Louisiana-Texas borderland. He's received support from the American Philosophical Society, the Louisiana Historical Association, and the Briscoe Center of American History. And he also has a forthcoming article regarding this region in the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society. Jackson's paper today is going to be about William Darby's map of the state of Louisiana and the extension of American sovereignty over the neutral ground. Jackson?
All right, I'm going to share my screen real quick. Can everybody, wait, let's see here. Okay. Wait. Okay, well, I guess y'all just see my notes on the side. All right, so today I kind of changed up the title a little bit, and I entitled it William Darby and American Border Making in the Louisiana-Texas Borderland. And so I'm glad I'm following Dr. MacDonald in his talk, because William Darby kind of builds off of and receives support from Dr. John Sibley. And Darby is going to create a map that we can see here. And he publishes this map in 1816, but really he's in the process of making it for about a decade. And so in November 1812, William Darby, Wallace, and two other unnamed men navigated through low-lying swamps on the north bank of the Sabine River. Darby hoped to pinpoint the intersection of the waterway with the 32nd parallel. And after 3 days, he concluded his calculations, though he did not guarantee the point was made with absolute accuracy, but the error, if any, cannot be very material. Furthermore, he speculated that, begin quote, from all appearances which I could discover, except for a few Indian traces, no other marks of the human race were visible. I was the first individual who ever reached that spot with any civilized object in view, end quote. Now, I could spend a whole hour talking, we could break that down with civilization, wilderness, and mapping, and how really what these guys are doing during this period is they're trying to apply natural knowledge to define American sovereignty and control over this area. And what Darby was doing when he marked that point on where the Sabine intersected the 32nd parallel is he was placing a boundary point that defined the western limits of the state of Louisiana. And that point marked the beginning of a meridian line that ran north to the 33rd parallel that would form the western boundary for the state as we see it in the map and still today. And so Darby, after satisfying himself with the border point, he and his party constructed pirogues and descended the Sabine River to complete the rest of the survey of Louisiana's boundaries. Now, William Darby is kind of this fascinating peripheral figure in American history because he's a person that contributes to American state development and cartographic improvements, but he also has largely eluded historical analysis. A map of the state of Louisiana and its accompanying a geographical description of the state of Louisiana, both published in 1816 by John Malesh, have received scholarly attention from both literary and geography specialists. J. Gerald Kennedy completed a biographical account of William Darby, and he conducted a pretty complete analysis of Darby's literary treatise that described the American frontier from the 18-teens to the 1840s. Geographical studies have analyzed the accuracy of Darby's map in terms of mathematical and scientific exactitude. Gay Gomez has highlighted that the map played an important role in populating blank spaces of previous maps. And Ralph Ehrenberg argues that Darby's map formed the standard cartographic image of Louisiana in the 18-teens and 20s. And then most recently, John Evans and Jim Tiller assert that Darby's map stood as the most accurate cartographic illustration of the state until the 20th century. However, his map did more than just depict survey measurements. This paper argues that William Darby's map represented a form of anticipatory empire that aided the extension of American sovereignty to the Sabine River. Darby's survey and resultant map expanded American knowledge of the region and its environs, and thus it increased American attachment to a remote region, and it cartographically reinforced the presumed limits of the United States. The map played a critical role in reappraising nation-state boundaries in relation to the limits of the Louisiana Purchase, and the map subsumed the neutral ground within its boundaries, despite the lack of an international treaty between Spain and the United States that defined the future of the territory. So, physical actions and local initiatives meant that Darby's cartography intersected geopolitical and social processes that were already at work in the Louisiana-Texas borderland. And so, in hindsight, we can kind of see the transcontinental treaty that we often view as defining what Louisiana was merely affirms Louisiana's western border. And looking at the Louisiana Purchase is important because it really establishes the background for why Darby's map is important and how it plays a role in influencing American ambitions in the region. So the Louisiana Purchase sparked a bitter geopolitical contest between Spain and the United States. Both countries sought to determine the boundaries, and a slew of issues increased tensions in the region between Natchitoches and Nacogdoches. Runaway slaves, Indian diplomacy, and military patrols meant that it always seemed that the area was on the brink of war. And these issues climaxed in the summer of 1806 when the Freeman Custis expedition attempted to ascend the Red River to its source. And that July, a large Spanish force under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Simón de Herrera stopped the expedition at present-day Spanish Bluff, Texas. And by late August 1806, William Claiborne had arrived in Natchitoches, and it seemed that war was pretty much inevitable. And all the American force was waiting on was the arrival of the infamous General James Wilkinson. And in typical Wilkinson fashion, he showed up about a month and a half late. And so the war was already, everybody had calmed down. It seemed everything was going to be okay. And Wilkinson insisted on marching to the Sabine River to confront the Spanish. And ultimately, Wilkinson and Herrera negotiated what has become known as the Neutral Ground Agreement on November 5th, 1806. And basically, this agreement established a demilitarized zone outside of the control of either Spain or the United States. And the region comprised roughly the area between the Sabine River in the west and the Calcasieu River, Arroyo Hondo, and Bayou Pierre in the east. And so Darby's map is going to eventually subsume this contested area into the boundaries of the state of Louisiana. And basically what I'm going to highlight is this map kind of shows how local actors seized the initiative to determine the course of imperial ambitions in this region. So beginning in 1805, William Darby, like Dr. John Sibley, had moved his way from the Northeast in Pennsylvania, and he wound up in Natchez, Mississippi in 1798. He married a very wealthy widower, and eventually, though, the plantation and barn burned down, and so he moves to Opelousas in 1805 to accept employment as a surveyor for the government land office there. And during the course of this employment, Darby hatches a plan to complete a map of the state of, or the territory of Orleans based on actual survey data. And so at the time, he's going around, he's completing kind of the first American surveys of the Atchafalaya Basin, St. Landry Parish, and Attakapaw Parish. And so he's kind of found this niche, and he's thinking in his mind, okay, there's no reliable map of the area. If I do that, then maybe I can make a ton of money by having the map makers in Philadelphia publish it. And so immediately he begins kind of compiling all of his notes. And the only map at the time is Barthélemy Laffon's Carte Générale du Territoire d'Orléans. And as you can see, looking at the map, Laffon's map actually has excellent data for the area around New Orleans and up the Mississippi River Valley. But you can see he puts the cartouche in the southwest corner, and it kind of, otherwise it would be completely blank. And so he's hiding what he doesn't know with the cartouche. And then on the upper left, you can see Matthew Carey's a map of Louisiana from his atlas of the different states and United States as a whole. And he has basically the same thing, where the entire southwestern quadrant of the state is completely blank. And I've also drawn in roughly where the neutral ground was, so you can see it in an image. And so basically Darby starts compiling his notes, and he's starting to make sketches. And in 1811, he decides that he needs to resign his commission so he can complete tours of the northern and western parts of the state. And so in the fall of 1811, Darby commences his first tour to kind of cover the northern part of the state. So he travels to Natchitoches, then to Fort Miro, and then to the Mississippi River before returning to Opelousas. And this is important because he kind of establishes his operating procedures, where he compiles extensive notes of the climate, the fauna, settlements, waterways, ferries, just anything that might be useful for future migrants that they might need whenever they're traveling through the region. And he also documents where land is available at the land office. So he's kind of providing this cheat sheet, if you will, for migrants and what they can find when they arrive. Now, what's important is, as he's doing this first tour, the territory of Orleans actually applies for annexation into the United States, or statehood. And so the proposed state constitution actually proclaims the Sabine River from its mouth to the 32nd parallel, then along a meridian line to the 33rd parallel, as the state's western border. This proposed boundary extended American claims over the disputed neutral ground without any mention of the agreement, the Wilkinson-Herrera agreement that was negotiated 5 years earlier. And so Congress, as they're processing Louisiana's application for statehood, actually this circumstances greatly change in the region. The Napoleonic Wars and Padre Hidalgo's rebellion in New Spain forced Spanish officials in Texas to look toward American markets for supplies. And the General Walter Overton estimated this trade, the Spanish trade that developed between 1810 and 1812, was worth about $300,000 in 1812. So this is significant sums of money. And obviously, when you have a lucrative trade, bandits are going to look toward the region and how they can manipulate its geopolitical murkiness to make out with some supplies or some Spanish silver. And so basically almost every Spanish trade caravan between 1811 and 1812 is robbed. And so this is where Governor William Claiborne is going to start to manipulate events in the neutral ground to extend American authority over the region. And the merchants in Natchitoches, they actually urged Claiborne to build a military base along the road to provide protection. And they send out a patrol looking to round up these bandits, and basically they end up arresting 9 people, and they try them in the territorial court. 7 are proved to actually live there permanently, and so they're acquitted. But 2 of the defendants are actually convicted, despite their defense that the neutral ground, as per the agreement between James Wilkinson and Simón de Herrera, was outside the sovereignty of either nation. Therefore, no national laws could be applied to the region. So if nobody owned the region, then there were no laws that were over it. However, their conviction symbolized this extension of judicial authority to the river. Now, even though the territorial court had now enforced American laws, local officials remained unsure of how aggressive they should extend civil authority, but clarity emerged about 2 weeks after the trial, when Congress ratified Louisiana's Charter for Statehood that validated the state's western boundary as the Sabine River. So now, William Darby, after this announcement happens, he has his western goal for the survey. So now he knows what the western boundary is. And so he begins making plans to complete a survey of the waterway and to pinpoint the intersection of the river and the 32nd parallel. He scheduled it for the fall of 1812, and about a month before he began his expedition, the McGee-Gutierrez expedition breaks loose in early August 1812. And so this filibuster operation under Augustus McGee and Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara invades Spanish Texas. And the relevance for Darby's map and the American annexation of the neutral ground is that it does 2 things. Number 1, it dismantled Spanish authority in Texas, and Spain no longer possessed the physical capability to dispute American ambitions in the neutral ground. And then second, Governor Claiborne utilized the chaos of the McGee-Gutierrez expedition to annex Bayou Pierre, which was the only remaining Spanish settlement east of the Sabine River. Claiborne and the state legislature actually approved the annexation of Bayou Pierre on the 25th of August, 1812, and they appointed Marcel de Soto, the Spanish Indian agent at Bayou Pierre, as a justice of the peace in Natchitoches Parish. So now civil authority is obviously extended to the Sabine River. And so William Darby's he's gonna go through and make this map of the state of Louisiana. And, this is a picture of what used to be the Arroyo Hondo. Obviously it looked different, but just to put it in everybody's mind that this was an international boundary line for about 6 years. So if you were not from the area, you could have easily maybe jumped across it to transfer over imperial boundaries. So, but as Darby is getting ready to launch this expedition, he arrives in Natchitoches in September 1812, and there he stays with Dr. John Sibley. And Sibley is going to provide him with tools to conduct astronomical readings, and he's going to provide him with guides, most importantly, Wallace. And we do not know Wallace's last name. He worked with Sibley. He was a contact for Sibley at the Indian Agency, and it seems that he was maybe a French mestizo, that he was a hunter, and so he's traversing all sorts of social boundaries in this area. So Darby with his guides, and they begin to navigate the region, and they travel from Natchitoches up to Bayou Pierre, and along the way they're traveling at a very leisurely pace. It takes them about 1 month to travel 130 miles to the Sabine River. And so Darby and his party, they stop and stay at Manuel Prudhomme's plantation, then they stop at Marcel de Soto's plantation, and then they actually stop at Wallace's home. And on this trip, Darby takes tons of notes on the fauna, the climate, and he's kind of collecting all this data and beginning to form it into what will become the geographical description of Louisiana. And so the party finally arrives at the Sabine River, and they spend 3 days traversing through this swamp, trying to figure out every night they'll try to take the measurements. And they only have a very limited time period, as kind of that winter rainy season is getting a little cloudy. So at night, he's really struggling to actually compute the astronomical readings or astrological readings. And Darby eventually finds his point that I talked about in the first paragraph. And then he kind of stakes this claim for American possession by invoking the idea of civilizing wilderness. And so that was kind of when he declares himself the first person with any civilized object in view. And so he's kind of showing this physical process of that Americans have this idea that possession is based on physical action compared to other forms of, ownership, land ownership. And what's interesting is Darby's point, despite all of these obstacles and rudimentary tools that he's using, is actually the most accurate calculation of the corner until the 20th century, and I guess the 1940s, when the Army Corps of Engineers remapped the borderline. And so at this point, what becomes obvious is that Darby's map has a lot of geopolitical complications or possibilities with it. And Wallace reported back to Dr. John Sibley that he thought that the Caddo and Nanticoke villages were actually outside of the borderline. And so Sibley immediately wrote that they needed to amend the state constitution to extend further in a northwestern direction to include these villages, or else Spain may be able to sway these tribes if they fell within Spanish limits instead of American limits after the production of the map. So Darby actually completes the first surveys of both the Sabine and Calcasieu rivers in this last part of his expedition. And he maps the river's courses, where ferries are, where villages are, what the landscape looks like, the bottomlands. And so he's adding all of this kind of natural knowledge that he's just observing. And when he puts it into published form, now you're going to have a public arena or public access for all this information. And so Darby, after he completes, he arrives back in Opelousas in January 1813, and he begins to make plans for publication. However, the outbreak of hostilities in the War of 1812 and then subsequent British operations in the Gulf delayed his publication plans. And so in the interim period, he began to share his map and treaties with high-ranking American officials stationed in and around New Orleans. Most notably, he worked as a topographical engineer for Andrew Jackson. And he showed his map to Andrew Jackson, Edmund Gaines, and William Claiborne. And Jackson declared, quote, "Darby's map was more correct than any of which had been published of that country," end quote. And so what's kind of revealing about all these endorsements that he gets is Darby's map appeased the territorial ambitions of American officials. And so eventually Edward Livingston, I showed a picture of him earlier, he helps fund Darby's travel back to Philadelphia to publish the map. And so Darby arrived in Philadelphia toward the end of the summer of 1815, and he quickly reached a deal with John Malesh, and his map and treatise hit the shelves in March, or end of March, beginning of April 1816 for $12. So that's pretty expensive for the time. So it's not like he's getting a wide circulation. However, what his survey did do is John Malesh took it and incorporated it into his own maps. And so you can see an example here in 1813, Malesh's cartographic image of Louisiana extended with a very elongated westward slope, I guess, along the Sabine River. And then comparatively, you can see the redefined image after Darby completes his survey, and in the image on the right in 1816. And so Darby's image, his cartographic image of Louisiana, while it may not have sold a lot on its own, it became the standard image in basically every map that's published after he gets to Philadelphia. Henry Tanner and Malesh both adopt it. And what's very interesting is in the winter of 1818 and into 1819, John Quincy Adams and Louis de Onis actually used Malesh's 1818 version map of the United States as their cartographic reference during their negotiations for the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819. And so Darby's image of Louisiana actually becomes like, what is the western boundary, right? And so Texas is awarded to Spain or Mexican possession, and then the American limits end on the Sabine River. And so inadvertently, Darby's survey of the Sabine River and then his map that he produces actually becomes the western limit of American sovereignty in the negotiations. And so what this all kind of shows is that, let me see if I missed any images. Okay. All right. So basically what this all shows is that with neither a treaty nor a military campaign, American officials annexed the neutral ground long before international authorities deemed it appropriate. William Darby's A Map of the State of Louisiana kind of culminated this process by making it kind of like a standard public image that this is Louisiana. And this annexation occurred well before the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819 affirmed American possession of the region. And the fact that negotiators recognized Militia's map as the authority on the Louisiana-Texas border underscored kind of the natural knowledge and intellectual authority that Darby's map and survey provided for American officials. And it also reflected local processes of American annexation, such as the conviction of bandits, the annexation of Bayou Pierre, and the appointment of Spanish officials as American justices of the peace. And so, you know, these processes did not rely on international treaty. Rather, local individuals shaped the region in a manner more conducive to their own ambitions. And in conclusion, the neutral ground ceased to be neutral long before a treaty officially decided its fate. Thank you all very much. Okay. Let me stop the screen share as soon as I can get it. All right. There we go.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Pearson. When you get a chance, there are several chats that you can take a look at, and you might be able to provide answers to those. Okay, our next paper today is by Dr. Samantha Cavell. She is from Southeastern Louisiana University, and Sam is an assistant professor of military history at Southeastern. She also holds a distinguished teaching endowment in the humanities. She earned her degree in naval and maritime history from the University of Exeter, where she received the Exeter Research Fellowship. She has publications which include Midshipman and Quarterdeck Boys in the British Navy, as well as chapter contributions to the Battle of New Orleans Reconsidered, and a U.S. Naval Academy publication called New Interpretations in Naval History, and From Across the Sea, North Americans in Nelson's Navy. The paper she's giving today is another topic that I have a lot of interest in, given my own work. Her presentation today is West India Slavery, the Royal Navy, and the Troubling Case of Admiral Alexander, Sir Alexander Forrester English Cochran. She didn't give the whole name, so I went ahead and threw it in. From 1807 to 1823. Sam?
Yeah.
Share your
Thanks.
knowledge portion.
Thanks, Gene. I appreciate it. I have to apologize. My paper's a bit of an outlier compared to the other two, so I hope you can bear with me as we shift.
Well, for me, it's not an outlier. For me, it's right in my wheelhouse.
A little further south. All right, this one's for you, Gene. All right, let me just go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, and present, slideshow from the beginning. Okay, all right, I hope you guys can see that. So we're going to be sort of moving the discussion down to issues about the Royal Navy, about the introduction of the Abolition Act, which came through in 1807, went into effect in 1807. And what I'm going to give you today is a synopsis of a paper that will actually be published in the Mariner's Mirror coming out in February next year. And it deals with this particular case of a senior Royal Navy officer who was serving in the West Indies, who was also a plantation owner in the colony of Trinidad. Now, these two roles, of course, became antithetical after Britain passed the Act for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which went into effect in May of 1807. And as the Royal Navy became the principal agency charged with enforcing the new law and suppressing the slave trade, Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochran, as Commander-in-Chief of the Leeward Island Station, would be duty-bound to act against his own interests as a planter who was dependent on an influx of enslaved labor. His actions relative to 106 African men, women, and children who were rescued from slave ships and brought into Tortola as refugees in early 1808 really demonstrates Cochran's ability to manipulate these nascent abolition laws by leveraging his power as a wartime protector of Britain's colonies in the region. It also showed his understanding of the fact that distance from the metropole afforded extraordinary leeway, especially when it came to plantations in Trinidad, and we'll look at why in a little bit. Cochran, in many ways, with his conflicting naval metropolitan versus colonial planter interests, embodied the contradictions that were inherent in Britain's attempts to enforce abolition amid a war that was being fought to protect the political and economic interests that were intimately linked to slavery. So for this presentation, I will just briefly address 4 factors. First, the illegality of Cochran's actions, not to mention their immorality. Second, the changing role of the Royal Navy as an agent of metropolitan interests in the West India colonies. Third, the inability of the African institution, which was set up by William Wilberforce, to police the Abolition Act and which failed to censure Cochran in any meaningful way. And finally, the specific role that Trinidad played in enabling Cochran's corruption to go unpunished. So, the problem all began when 2 slave ships were captured by the Royal Navy and brought into Tortola in February of 1808, with hundreds of now free Africans who were, most of them, desperately in need of medical care. The colony was very ill-equipped to deal with this humanitarian crisis that was now on its shores, especially in light of the fact that the Abolition Act demanded that anyone taken from a slave ship, a recaptive, or someone freed from slavery from an enemy colony, a French colony, would either have to be first taken into the Navy or the West India regiments, so conscripted essentially, or they had to be placed in an apprenticeship as either an apprentice to a trade or to domestic work. Under no circumstances were freed Africans, these recaptives, to be employed in agricultural labor. In other words, they were not to be assigned to the same kind of labor as enslaved people were. The intent here was that after a 14-year apprenticeship, these free men and women would be Christianized and able to support themselves as free wage laborers. As Commander-in-Chief of the squadron that protected Tortola, Cochran wielded much influence over the decisions about what to do with the refugees. Now, 36 of them were actually conscripted into naval service, and a handful were distributed among some of the officials who were living in Tortola and apprenticed to domestic trades there. But the majority, 106 of them, were taken by Cochran to work on his sugar estates in Trinidad, which already employed more than 200 enslaved laborers, so they were huge. Now, Cochran did absorb the cost of victualling, clothing, and providing medical care to these refugees, but based on the financial problems that his estates were experiencing, and he writes about this constantly, it seems pretty clear that he did so with the full intention of putting them to work as agricultural laborers to augment his enslaved workforce. The question then becomes, well, how did he get away with this unlawful and immoral act? And the answer lies partly in the changing nature of the naval-colonial relationship that was brought about by the Abolition Act. There were very strong traditional ties between social and naval networks in the West Indies, and these were challenged when the Navy became the enforcer of laws that were inimical to planter interests. In response to changing metropolitan cultural norms related to issues of slavery, the government in London was seeking to attain greater control over the colonial sphere, to rein in the political independence of the colonies and also what was generally understood to be the immorality of planters who were known to be extremely brutal towards their enslaved people, and that this brutality was likely to incite rebellion or outright revolution. And it had happened before, going back to Jamaica several decades before, and more recently in Saint-Domingue. And this is an excerpt of a newspaper article talking about a trial of a planter from Tortola in 1811 who was tried and executed. He was hanged for the murder of an enslaved man named Prosper. So it's an indication, just one indication of many, that times were changing. Now, as far as rebellion brought on by brutal treatment of enslaved people, well, insurrection in the midst of a worldwide war that would soon expand to include the United States was not something that the government could tolerate on a military, political, or an economic level. The weakness of the colonial position in wartime presented the Crown then with an opportunity to leverage naval protection against the colonial desire to maintain their legislative autonomy and oppose the Abolition Act in any way they could. For planters, the presence of a senior naval officer sympathetic to their plight meant that any and all deference would be given to Cochran. And when he captured the French island of Guadeloupe in 1810 and became governor, well, his position as a bulwark of colonial causes was cemented, despite his official duty to enforce the will of the metropole. Now, supporting the Crown's moral and religious argument against slavery and the slave trade was the African Institution. It was headed up by William Wilberforce, one of the godfathers of abolition in Britain, and its mission was to set up a free colony in Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa, where recaptives could be sent, where they would be Christianized, and where they would also be apprenticed to trade. So apprenticeships were central to the mission of Sierra Leone as well. Now, the secretary of the African Institution, Zachary Mccauley, was someone who'd actually kept an eye on Cochran for quite some time. Going back to 1808 and 1811, he'd actually accused Cochran of illegal slave trading and of selling recaptives back into slavery, although a lack of proof stymied any ability that he had to actually go after Cochran legally. In 1812, however, Mccauley received word that Cochran's refugees from Tortola had not been apprenticed to trades, but were, quote, under a driver's lash, being worked and flogged on his sugar estates. Now, Cochran responds to these accusations with a letter defending himself, which actually reads as a fairly pitiful collection of claims, swinging from cries of his extreme poverty, which he made often, to his insistence of the fact that he was an extremely benevolent master, to the claim that his laborers actually worked half as hard as any day laborers back in England. And proof of his excellent care, he said, was visible in the fact that most of the refugees were still alive after 3 years, which was something in Trinidad, because Trinidad at this time was known for being particularly deadly to workers, enslaved or free. The more strenuous his protests, the deeper Cochran dug himself into a hole, virtually admitting in his letter what he had done. And yet, no action was ever taken by civil or naval authorities to censure Cochran for his violations. He maintained his refugees and operated his estates with no oversight beyond registration of his enslaved people, which was required by Crown law in Trinidad. And Trinidad really is the other part of the explanation as to how and why Cochran evaded prosecution. Trinidad was set up as a Crown colony, under direct control of the Secretary of State for War in the Colonies, rather than having its own independent legislature, which really made Trinidad quite unique in the colonial collective of the West Indies. The government in London had dreams of establishing Trinidad as a new model colony based on free wage Creole labor. Now, this was supposed to get the West Indies ready for the post-abolition era. But the reality of trying to turn an underdeveloped and underpopulated island into a sugar-producing dynamo meant that its success was dependent on investors who were willing to come in and shell out the money and import the enslaved labor that would be needed to clear and cultivate the land. And as a result, more than 10,000 enslaved people would arrive in Trinidad between 1802 and 1804 alone. In 1813, the new governor of the island, Sir Ralph Woodford, who also took his orders directly from Lord Bathurst, the Secretary of State in London, demonstrated a clear willingness to give whatever concessions were necessary to planters like Cochran when it came to the administration of their enslaved and apprenticed workforces. By the end of the year, in 1813, Cochran would be named Commander-in-Chief of the North America Station in the war against the United States. He was now once again a serious power player within the Navy, who no governor of a struggling colony would dare cross. Even with the end of the wars against America and France in 1815, Cochran's untouchability continued. As the African institution's attention focused more heavily on Sierra Leone, and the Royal Navy devoted its full attention to slave trade suppression, most specifically off the coast of Africa, Cochran could rely on the security of his position in Trinidad. Now, that said, the African institution did not forget about him entirely. In 1823, the apprenticeships of the Tortola captives were about to expire, and Wilberforce had been hearing some pretty nasty stories and decided to put together a commission to go and look into their stories and check up on their progress. Now, 2 investigators were sent to Tortola, and they did meet with a number of the recaptives, the refugees who were still there. Many of them had disappeared, but neither of these commissioners showed any interest in wanting to go to Trinidad and find out what had actually happened to Cochran's recaptives, the 106 people that he had taken in. So once again, he was free to deal with his recaptives as he wished without oversight or consequence. So in summary, it really is a perfect storm of factors that protected Cochran's interests. First, support came from civilian authorities in the West Indies, who depended upon naval protections, especially in times of war. His service rank made him a player of political and naval consequence, and his influence in naval matters remained high even when he was not on active duty, when he was simply a governor. His social rank and position as governor of Guadeloupe, combined with his landholding status, garnered him colonial support as a credible agent of planter interests. Second, the focus of metropolitan authorities, including the Admiralty and Colonial Office, was until 1815 aimed at bringing an end to the slave trade within the larger goal of winning a multifaceted war. At the same time, the economic viability of the colonies had to be maintained. And relative to these factors, the amelioration of slavery and policing of apprenticeships was of secondary importance. Finally, the exceptional situation of Trinidad, a struggling colony in whose success lay the ambitions of the state, meant that Cochran would be granted much freedom in the operation and management of his properties. The conflicting interests of the government itself were visible in the handling of the Trinidad colony. Politicians sought to create an ideal free labor state, a new model for the plantation system, and at the same time, they also sought to create a profit center. But labor needed to turn Trinidad into a workable farm area meant that profitability could not be achieved without enslaved labor. And as a result, Cochran was spared the scrutiny that many of his contemporaries in the more established colonies faced when it came to dealings with enslaved workers and apprenticed workers for that matter. Now, Cochran's conflicts of interest were, for the most part, left to coexist in the chaos of war, imperial politics, and the quest for profit. Each of these factors enabled an opportunist like Cochran to game the system and for nearly 2 decades to win. So perhaps it is fitting that his good fortunes did not last. Massive debts had accrued, and by 1829, Cochran was desperate to sell all of his interests in Trinidad. He was actually unable to sell the land or his enslaved people for more than a quarter of their appraised value, so he decided to hold out until his creditors finally filed suit against him in December of 1831. 1 month later, Cochran died suddenly, probably of a heart attack or a stroke brought on by the strain of the lawsuits. He was penniless, he left no will, and despite the efforts of his son, who was also a Royal Navy captain, Thomas John Cochran, all the property went to his creditors in an effort to help clear the debt. So in many ways, the trajectory of Cochran's story, from his devious manipulation of the abolition laws to, quite frankly, his eventual ruin, which was circumstances of his own making. He was the one who invested in a fickle crop that demanded labor in a dwindling slave economy. And these mirrored the failings of the national experience in bringing an end to the slave trade. Thank you. All right.
Thank you very much, Sam. I'm sure you're familiar with Cochran's the accusations against Cochran during the War of 1812, that the slaves he was liberating, he was sending them to his plantation, and he had a whole long paper trail of defending that. So
he did, and there's no evidence that I found that he actually did that, because at that time he was being pretty heavily policed, and we actually know what happened. This is a kind of a nice connection. Should I be answering this now? Is that okay? I don't know.
Quick.
Okay. So he actually took a lot of the people who had come to him as colonial Marines, the runaway enslaved people from the Chesapeake, from Georgia, from Louisiana, from Florida, Spanish Florida, and they all went to Bermuda first, because most of them had been sent off to get ready to go into the West India regiments, but they refused to go. And there's a lot of correspondence of Cochran is desperately trying to find permanent jobs for these colonial Marines in Bermuda at the dockyards, where they were employed for a little while. And I came to find out the reason is he didn't want them shipped down to Trinidad, because that was what the government was going to do, was to send these retired soldiers effectively down to Trinidad, give them 16 acres of land each, and say, here you go and set up a farm and go for your life. He didn't want that influx of free African labor coming into the island.
Certainly.
And that's why he was trying to get them jobs in Bermuda.
Well, and many of them end up in Belize as well.
And Belize, some of them go there too. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Comments today on these papers is going to be offered by the distinguished Professor Robin Hermann, who is the Richard Nieheisel Professor of European History at the University of Louisiana Lafayette. He's published many articles on English imperial and Atlantic history. He teaches classes on early modern Britain, Europe, the British Empire, the Atlantic world, and perhaps most importantly, the history of European witchcraft. So, Robin, please enlighten us.
All right, I'll give it my best. Thank you all. So we have 21 minutes. So I don't want to talk too long, because I want to give the panelists time to respond to my questions. But I hope that there are questions from the audience. So I'm not going to do the whole spiel, but I'll just do a mini spiel. So I thought these were very interesting papers that speak to each other in some pretty obvious ways, maybe some less obvious ways. John Sibley pokes his head up a couple of times in interesting ways. So the thing that I was most struck by, and I have individual questions for all of y'all, but the thing that I was struck most by is, obviously these are all papers about empire in some way. And I think it might be helpful to think about a phrase that Dr. MacDonald used in his paper about Jefferson's empire of liberty. which is an extremely potent phrase and, slightly paradoxical one. So I thought, there might be some interest there. We could unpack that. Also, I'm fascinated by how the relationship in each of these papers between, as I believe it was Mr. Pearson said, the man on the spot and the metropole, right? If we think of either, Louisiana as the periphery and Washington as the metropole, or Trinidad as the periphery and, London as the metropole, right? That there seem to be interesting comments in all of these papers about, the weakness of the metropole to get things done, and what the man on the spot, it's all men in this case, right? The man on the spot are getting up to in their respective peripheries. And then finally, of course, me as a British imperial historian, right? I'm thinking of the early 19th century as a period of informal empire, right? That's a term we don't really use that much anymore, but that when I was in graduate school, that was the phrase we used to describe this, time frame of British imperial processes. So what I guess, let's see, I have, so my big questions. In what ways in each of your papers do we see this notion of trying to create an empire of liberty, either in the American sense or the British sense? What does that mean in those contexts, right? It would be very interesting to me if there were similar answers to those questions, right, across the national or international divides. Then so that's one sort of big question. Another big question would be, how can we really talk about thinking about informal empires, right? Can we really talk about empire? Do we talk about empire? How do we think about empire? If it's really these guys in the periphery that are making the changes, right? Directing these processes. If the governor can't prosecute Cochran, right, despite his clear violation of laws for decades, right? To what, should we bring back the old thesis of informal empire? That kind of thing. And, if we are talking about empire, is that, for the early 19th century, is that historiographically important for us as scholars of America and Britain? Is it politically important today, right, in 2020, to think about what, the legacy of these three, imperial moments in the early 19th century, right? It's one of the most interesting things about this paper, about these papers, right, is that they all are focusing on a very, very similar, very close period of time. So that's a lot of stuff I just said. So anybody want? I mean, like I said, if we finish answering those questions, I have specific questions for all of y'all. But I thought it might be most interesting to talk about, the overlap and the similarity and the connections between the three papers.
Well, thank you, Robin. That's very poignant comments. And we'll ask if any of our presenters would like to address either any of these three issues. The question about the empire of liberty and what does it mean, or how do we think of empire? Is it just simply the person on the ground, or the legacy of imperial moments? Any one of our presenters want to offer a shot at this?
Sure, I'll say briefly that as far as Sibley was concerned with Jefferson, it got down to the idea, probably on instructions from Claiborne, I would imagine that we have to establish American sovereignty as quickly as possible and by any means necessary. And that came through to Sibley as, okay, whatever you need to do to get information about the Red River. And there's been debate about how far he traveled north of Natchitoches, probably not that far. And he got information that was either old or done by other folks. And but I think with Sibley, he wanted to, again, make the United States the authority up on the Red River and not Spain. And he was willing to, again, use alliances with Native Americans, presentation of gifts. There's even a story, of course, of the American flag being taken by some Spanish soldiers when they went to the Caddo villages and then replaced. But he would later say, you know, if you furnish the best supplies, you will win their allegiance. So that literally, to me, is what he was kind of very much the person who was there and following Jefferson's idea of, okay, you know, the American authority here is weak. We expect to get more people down here, flooding into the area, and one way or the other, we'll become a legitimate power there. And from that position, we can, I think, get more territory. And that, I think, goes into what you know, we have with the map drawing as well. We kind of link those two things together.
You care if I jump in here?
Yeah, go ahead, Jackson.
So one thing I'd like to throw in is that I know my map was about, or my paper was about William Darby and kind of this American map making and looking for an image that suits ambitions. But, you know, it wasn't created in a vacuum. And so Darby's project is competing with Spanish projects that are trying to do the same thing. And so the Commandant General Nemesio Salcedo, that was the over the interior province, is actually, I think he funded basically an 8-year project to map what the limits of Louisiana were. And so Padre Jose Antonio de Pichardo, I think his treatise that's published in 4 volumes is probably the most, it's kind of the end product. Mm-hmm. But, you know, all these maps are kind of trying to, I guess, show a vision of empire that is befitting to the metropoles. And so what is going to appease the center, even though it's created on the periphery, they're, you know, intertwined, I guess.
Okay, that's very interesting.
And Robin, I think that's brilliant to draw a thematic line through Empire of Liberty. Well done. An easy connection to make. I think that the idea of consolidation of empire in Britain's case is something that we see starting really with the Napoleonic Wars, like starting 1802, 1803. Of course, Trinidad was only formally a colony of Britain in 02. They captured it in the previous century from the French, and it's one of the few things they don't give back at the Treaty of Amiens. But with this new colony, there's also going to be a sense of, all right, well, how do we now get control of all the old colonies, Jamaica, Antigua, Bermuda? You know, how are we now going to bring these independently legislated entities under the colonial umbrella? And that's the only way we're going to get a handle on the problem of brutal enslavement that's going on in all of these colonies. And I think it comes from a public outcry. I think that there are economic factors. I mean, we talk for days about all the factors that bring about the abolitionist ideas. But the only way that a sense of freedom within empire is going to happen is if the metropole gets greater control over the West India colonies. Okay?
It's such a paradox.
It is, right? I mean, the whole thing is a paradox. Cochrane is a paradox. Trinidad itself is a paradox. Like, the whole thing is a paradox. But that's the only way they're going to be able to force these slaveholders into giving up the means of their wealth, and start to make changes. And Canning, George Canning, who will eventually become prime minister for a short while, is really instrumental in trying to push through this new vision of what a post-abolition colonial world looks like, and been trying to set it up as a free labor Creole state. They're desperately worried about rebellion. I mean, this is the driving force here. Canning's not worried about religion, not like Wilberforce and the African Institution. I mean, they're all driven by Christianity.
Right.
Canning is strictly about, no, it's that we need to get control. And by control, we mean calming the population and removing the potential for this disaster, especially in a time of war. So, the wartime issue is central to the whole discussion as it's beginning. But it takes a long time. I mean, 1834 before we can abolish slavery.
Right.
And then before most enslaved people in the colonies are released, we're looking at 1838. So we've got a long way to go.
All right, great. I mean, well, it's a great answer. It's not a great thing. Thank you. So how do we want to, we have 8 minutes, Gene. Do we want to open up?
You've got another thoughtful question that will kind of put them on their toes. I like those.
I don't have a big question for all of y'all, but we could I have a couple of specific, well, I could just do like one question for each of them. And then
That'll work.
See how that goes.
Make sure they answer quickly.
Okay. So for James, you mentioned in your paper, and I thought this was compelling and convincing, this larger strategic vision that emerges from a careful reading of Sibley. Where did he get that? Like, was it his vision? Is it just a sort of general idea that like, these are the things that are important for a settlement? Was it coming from Jefferson? I would, just a couple minutes on that.
I can only speculate on that, but I think it has to be from the folks he is in contact with when he gets to South Louisiana by way of New Orleans, and then he makes his way up the Mississippi River. He's not directly, at least that I know of, in contact with Jefferson before, although that letter may exist or doesn't exist anymore, or maybe disappeared. But no, I think it's talking to the folks past and present who were officials there.
Okay.
In areas of the territories of Mississippi, and then again Claiborne was just transitioning over from Mississippi to Louisiana, and I think from him he probably got this idea like, okay, you can almost imagine him, here's the map, or here's a map, or here's what we know. here's Natchitoches, here's the Red River. The Spanish, we know significant Indian populations along the Red River, north of the Red River, and we're in the process of now securing and moving the old French fort back to high ground above the river. And so, when you get here, if you could, again, I wish I had that, that letter, that smoking gun letter that said, and this is the conversation that they had. But I think Sibley's just, again, pretty spot on with some of the decisions that he makes, until he kind of wears out his welcome with the people in Natchitoches, and they drive him out in 1815. But certainly, I can see him talking with especially Claiborne, saying, look, we don't know a lot about what's up here. We know, of course, we, the United States, have to become the legitimate authority in this area, and then eventually we can move from a position of we don't know much, but we're here, to a position of strength. And you see compromise agreements, the neutral ground. Mm-hmm. And then from there, I mean, Sibley in the 18 teens goes out and starts getting involved in some of the adventures of trying to lead revolutions in Spanish Texas. So, but no, I think that's conversations he's had with people in South Louisiana. And then he was pretty much, if you could do this, or don't have a really good person right now and provide us with information, because in the background, very quickly, I'll just say that there was rumors floating about Sibley basically leaving his family. And those were published in the newspapers in New Orleans, and all of a sudden it became, okay, is this the guy we want? And then in the territorial letters, you'll see, Jefferson going back and forth with the Secretary of War Dearborn saying, well, I don't know, this guy's character, we're hearing stuff, I don't know. And then your Sibley saying, I'm just going to give them as much as I can, even though I haven't even seen some of these places. I have it on good authority that this is what the river above Grand Ecore looks like. And then all of a sudden their worries, at least about his personal scandals, if they exist, are put aside.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. MacDonald.
So for Jackson, again, lots of questions I wrote down when I read your paper, but the phrase that stuck out at me the most is this phrase that I'd never heard before until today. I read it in your paper, obviously, but where does this phrase "anticipatory empire" come from?
Okay, so the Anticipatory Empire is actually from J.B. Harley. And he's kind of like the cartographic guy.
Okay.
And so he kind of writes about it as viewing it from like a metropole sense, where map makers and capitals are drawing maps based on their strategic vision of places that they've never seen.
Okay.
And so anyway, go.
No, that's a fascinating phrase. So do we know if like his first map, or you mentioned he did 2 reports, and so the second report seems to have had a lot of play with politicians. Do we know if there's any connection between his first report and then the annexation request?
The first kind of survey that he runs?
Yeah.
There's not any play. It's just kind of coincidental.
Okay.
That the territory applies for statehood, and then kind of the parameters of his project changes in his mind, because he knew he hadn't really decided what he would survey as the western limit.
Mm-hmm.
And then once the state constitution is proposed, then he reorients his goal to survey the Sabine.
Okay.
And so he's kind of following, it's all coincidental for him.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, great, thank you. All right, one last question, we have 2 minutes. Okay, Sam. So did Cochran's crimes, were they part of the abolitionist campaign at all? I mean, you mentioned that Wilberforce talks a lot about, that there were stories and rumors that circulated back to him about Cochran. Did that become part of the wider abolitionist campaign in any way? Do you know?
Not for him personally.
Oh.
That I'm aware of. They're far more worried about dealing with slave ships that are being captured off of the west coast of Africa, especially as we get past the war. Like during the war, he's free to get away with anything, and then after that, the Navy almost immediately turns its attention to slave trade interdiction. So that is the big effort that's going on here, and Wilberforce is fully focused on that. He's actually also going to be indicted himself. There are some abuses reported in the apprenticeships going on in Sierra Leone. So he kind of has to leave Cochran alone while he deals with some of his own problems.
I had no idea.
Yeah. So the idea of trying to police Cochran, someone like Cochran, and giving them their comeuppance, it was just never going to happen. I mean, not in any of the economic rationales that existed was that ever going to happen.
And he doesn't get like bad PR in London. Like,
no, his bad PR comes from losing at New Orleans. He's the only senior officer left standing, basically, after the Battle of New Orleans. So he's the guy who cops all the blame, and
my goodness,
he will never be employed at sea again. He's employed he gets a job in 1821. So what's that? 6 years later,
right,
as CNC of the Plymouth Dockyard, and he has that for about 4 years, that post. But he's a retired admiral, really, after New Orleans. And fortunately, that only has to do with his making some lousy decisions and
Right.
being alive.
Not being a slaver or anything.
No, not to do with that. No, he gets away with all of that. Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic. You know, I have to admit, this panel today, I was so excited about it because, you know, Dr. MacDonald and Jackson are working on the Gulf territorial expansion issues. And I've written a little bit about that. And then, of course, you, Sam, you're dealing with Cochran. And I've written a little bit about Cochran, too. I'm always interested in learning more. So thank you so much, guys. And, you know, as we wrap up today, there have been a number of people posting chats. If our speakers today would just kind of glance at the chats and see if there's any questions that they can perhaps answer, please do so. And thank you all for your support of the Louisiana Historical Association. If you are not a member, be sure to join. So thank you and have a pleasant evening.